Welcome to the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Our 2020 virtual season is broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Welcome to the Writers Festival. My name is Sean Wilson. I'm the festival's artistic director, and I want to thank you for joining us. My guest today is Merlin Sheldrake, and what's really interesting for me is I first met Merlin in the pages of a book, Robert McFarlane's Underland, and he plays a pivotal role in that remarkable story, and it was so fascinating to stumble upon his name on the side of a book, Merlin Sheldrake. And I'm like, I know that name. I know that guy. And my son Aiden, who had read Underland with me, said, that's Merlin from the book. You got to get that. So I picked it up, and Entangled Life is just a phenomenal, remarkable, it's a page turner. And everyone laughs when I say it's a page turner about fungus. And everyone's like, well, no. And I'm like, honestly, I could not put it down. So Merlin Sheldrake is a biologist and a writer, received a PhD in tropical ecology from University of Cambridge for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama, where he was a predoctoral research fellow of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. He's a musician and, importantly for me, a keen fermenter. I do hope we get to fermentation in a bit. And so I want to start with, the obvious. For most of us, fungus isn't really top of mind. It's a pizza topping, a drug, maybe an infection of some kind, but mainly we think of it, or I did, as just a strange plant. And yet, Merlin, you point out that they're an entire kingdom of life, as diverse and plentiful as plants or animals, but they're just sort of out of sight. And I'm hoping we can start. One of the things that just blew my mind about your book was the fundamental role that fungus, and lichen specifically, but fungus plays in life as we know it on Earth. That the idea that this thing that we don't even really think about that often is the fundamental necessary ingredient between inanimate and animate life. And so is that a good place to start? Can you walk us through why fungus is so important, what its role is in life on Earth?
Yeah, there are so many ways to think about this. One of them is that, as you say, fungi are able to mine minerals from rocks, essentially, from inanimate mineral mass, and use those minerals to build compounds within their own bodies. And when they die or are eaten by other organisms, those minerals then enter the metabolic cycles of the living. And this was a big deal for plants, land plants, and the evolution of land plants. And when they came onto land about 500 million years ago as algae, with no root systems, no ability to forage in solid ground or among these rocks where they now had to make their home, these fungi that they partnered with were able to help them because they were expert foragers in these young soils. And using acids and high pressure, these fungi could burrow into solid rock and mine these minerals and transfer them to these plants, and in exchange for sugars and lipids that the plants are making in photosynthesis. And this ancient alliance has given rise to life on land as we know it. All recognizable life on land is underpinned by this fertile relationship. And so this ability to mine minerals from rock continues to the present day and never stops to be important. Lichens are another examples of this. They are fusions of fungi and other symbiotic organisms, whether algae or bacteria. And lichens are very ingenious digesters of rock, have a big fondness for rock. There's a funny article that came out a few years ago. Well, not so funny maybe for some, but for someone interested in the metabolic powers of lichen, I found it amusing that the lichen was digesting the faces of the presidents on Mount Rushmore, and these faces of the presidents had to be pressure hosed to remove these lichenous growths to prolong the life of the monument. So I was just there in the front row seat laughing at that story, because it reminds us that these organisms can change the face of the planet,
and are still so now. But it's even the notion is roots. This had never even occurred to me that you talk about I mean, all plants, all trees have roots, but it appears as though roots are not native to plant, that this is something they borrowed, an innovation they took from fungi. Am I getting that right? Is it really that roots themselves wouldn't exist without the fungus first?
Well, it's not so much that they borrowed them, it's more that for the first 60 million years or so of life on land, fungi behaved as plants' root systems. They didn't have root systems, and so fungi were their root systems. And then after these several million years, plants evolved their own roots. But the roots that they evolved were then doing the jobs that the fungi had been doing for them. And so it's less that they acquired roots from fungi and more that roots followed fungi into being.
So I'm wondering if you can, you so much of the book gives this sense of wonder and for me of just awe of how much is happening that we've never really thought about. Now, what drew you first to this field of study? It's something that you point out not many people are going into. What was it that sort of was your doorway into this other world?
One was decomposition and these amazing abilities of fungi to digest the world around us. If you look around you in any kind of natural space, or even just in your backyard, things turn to soil. Solid lumps of wood, they turn to soil. How are these changes? Created, and how are these organisms that oversee these changes? How do they live their life, and how do they control their behaviors, and how can they have such voracious appetites all so invisibly? And these were questions that puzzled me as a child and still puzzle me. And we live in the space that decomposition lives behind. We don't think about these organisms. Nonetheless, we live in a space created by them. And this is just a huge thought for me. And so this led me to fungi and to these other microbes that help decompose so many aspects of the world and make our life possible. Another route in for me was symbiosis, the ways that organisms find intimate ways to share bodily space, to share their lives with each other in collaborative ways. And so much of life is a symbiotic phenomenon. In fact, we carry around more microbial cells than our own cells, without which we wouldn't grow and behave as we do. All life forms are made up of symbiotic relationships. And fungi are major symbiotic players in some of the biggest symbiotes on the planet, in the history of the planet. And so I came to fungi through my study of these relationships between plants and their root fungi. And the more I thought about these fungi, the more I thought about where they were living. And the more I thought about where they were living, the more I thought about the other fungi that they were living with. And it sort of went on and on like that. And like so many who are interested in fungi, it's an ever deepening curiosity. The more you think about it, the more you want to know.
Just going back to the notion of the lichen, it's so interesting to me. You talk about how just even the concept of symbiosis was difficult for Western science to grapple with, right? The idea of, for a long time, I mean, most of our thinking is predator and prey. It's there's winners and losers, and yet within the fungal world, it is symbiotic. And I'm wondering if you can just give us a little more about the ways that lichen, like what lichen actually is and why it's so fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, lichens have become these symbiotic icons and real gateway organisms into this concept of collaboration in nature. And so in the 19th century, when evolutionary theory was being developed and generalized and applied in all sorts of different ways to the living world, the ways that people conceived of the interactions between organisms, they are reflected in some way the social beliefs and characters of the time. So in England, evolution was seen to proceed as unmitigated conflict and competition, and this mirrored views of human social progress within industrial capitalist systems. In other parts of the world, in Russia, for example, there was a greater emphasis on cooperation and the ways that organisms can work together to accomplish their ends. And so, of course, we need both sides of the story, and symbiosis has it's been a controversial subject for many since then. Thankfully, in recent years, it's becoming more and more accepted as the evidence for its great importance in the history of life becomes more and more incontrovertible. But in the 19th century, there was a botanist called Schwendener, and he was studying lichens, and these were conceived of as a kind of lower plant until this point. And so he was chopping up these lichens and looking inside them under a microscope, and he found that they didn't seem to be made up of one organism that had previously been thought. They seemed to be made up of a fungus and an alga. And so Schwendener put forward a controversial hypothesis called the dual hypothesis of lichens. And what it meant is that these lichens are not one organism, they're actually two organisms working together to produce what appears to be one organism. And it was a radical idea because at that point, and up until that point, the only way that organisms were understood to share bodily space with each other was as parasites or as agents of disease. So the idea of sharing bodily space in some kind of constructive way was shocking to many. And so Schwendener's theory was treated with some suspicion and was fiercely debated. But in the subsequent years, it became clear to anyone who actually took a look that this was indeed what was going on. And a German botanist called Frank, he then coined this word symbiosis to describe the living together of different organisms in a way that didn't prejudice this relationship. You know, symbiosis could include parasites, it could include agents of disease, but it also could include those mutually beneficial relationships. And so this is how lichens gave rise to this concept. And once this concept had been coined, then other major symbiotic discoveries were made. The relationship between plants and their symbiotic root fungi, their mycorrhizal partners, corals, the symbiotic nature of corals. And so lichens became a symbiotic principle. When a researcher found viruses living inside bacteria, he called them microlichens. And so lichens became this principle of cooperation in nature and really helped to change the direction of biological thought.
And I mean, you go, I think, so far as to suggest that it may be time for us to let go of the word biology and instead look at ecology when it comes to what is happening in us. Am I right about, is that a fair reading of what you're talking about, that we're not independent?
Well, I would never suggest getting rid of the word biology because this is the study of life, and so it's still a broad general term that I would hope to use. What I meant in that part, in the book, where I was talking about how I was at this conference, and a conference on tropical microbes in Panama, and we were all sitting there talking about microbes and listening to presentations on microbes, and someone got up to give this talk, and they said, this type of plant that we all know, this type of plant, we know as this type of plant because of these chemicals it produces in these leaves. And their leaves is a kind of diagnostic feature of these plants. It's one of the things that makes these plants these plants. And they said, actually, it's a fungus that lives in their leaves that produces this chemical. And then someone next to me was like, I think it's a bacteria inside the fungus. And then someone's like, no, I think it's the virus inside the bacteria inside the fungus. And this idea that we have to keep redrawing our conception of what these biological entities are. And when we realize that actually this is life all the way down, these nested relationships. Fungi have bacteria living inside them. Bacteria, big ones, can have smaller bacteria living inside them. Large viruses can have smaller viruses living inside them. This is just how life works. Lynn Margulies described life as the long-lasting story of the long-lasting intimacy of strangers, and this really is the case. And once we think about life like that, once we think about these biological individuals like that, what we once called an individual, once we realize that these individuals are in fact ecologies, as you are, as I am, as we all are, walking ecologies, then it becomes, that's where I was thinking about, well, maybe all biology has transformed into ecology, because we no longer can think about the study of individual organisms. We can only think about the study of the relationships between organisms, because that's what life really is. And so that was what I was toying with in that passage. And I still think that much of biology is rapidly transforming into ecology.
Now, one of the really fascinating things is this notion of communication between different kingdoms of life. And you illustrate that in a number of ways in the book, but I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about something, the cutter ants and the relationship between them and fungus. Like, just start with that, how they work together.
Yeah, so it's one of the most amazing stories of cooperation in the history of life, in the history of animals for sure. And so leafcutter ants are these prodigious social ants, and they live in Latin America and Central America, and they harvest leaves. And you might have seen them in these parts of the world, these long lines of ants carrying little fragments of leaf. They look a little bit like sails. And they take them back to their nests, which can be enormous, some of the largest societies formed by any animal group. And they feed these fragments of leaf to a fungus. And the fungus digests the leaf, and the ants eat the fungus. And so it's a kind of agriculture, and it's gone on for tens of millions of years. And so long before human agriculture arose, long before humans arose, full stop. And you can think of it in one sense as the ants are cultivating the fungus, without which they could not survive and which they have to feed and nourish. And you can also think about it as the fungus cultivating the ants, these organisms with twitchy muscular bodies that can go out and forage for it. The fungus can't forage on its own. So the fungus just sits there and they feed it with fragments of leaf. And so it's this very amazing way that this ant civilization is powered. And it's more complicated than that as well. So these fungal gardens are vulnerable to the spread of another type of fungus that can run through the garden and infect it. It's a bit like our monocultures are vulnerable to the spread of diseases, and so are the ants' monocultures. And so to defend themselves from this fungal pest, ants carry around in special glands on their bodies bacteria which produce chemicals which deter the fungus that could destroy their garden. So it's really quite sophisticated and far more ancient than any human practice by millions and millions of years.
And it's so clearly not binary, right? I mean, this is one of the there is as I love the word entangled, because that really does seem to describe everything. Now, recently, I think for most of us, the notion of the World Wood Web really caught on a few years ago. The idea that forests perhaps are more like us in the sense that they are an ecosystem. Each forest is its own, is in fact connected underground. Can you talk a little bit about that, the World Wood Web?
The Wood Wide Web.
Wood Wide Web. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, so these plants' relationship with their root fungi that I was talking about earlier, the relationships that help to pull plants out onto the land, these fungi, almost all plants depend on these fungi to this day. And these fungi are promiscuous, so one fungal network can connect with more than one plant. And plants too are promiscuous, and one plant can connect with more than one fungal network. And the result is that you can have these shared networks, so fungal networks shared between different plants. And through these networks, compounds can pass between plants, nutrients can pass between plants, signaling compounds, stress compounds can pass between plants. So it allows some kind of communication between different plants. How exactly this is regulated, we're still not sure. How far these networks can spread and how exactly they behave in the forest, it's very hard for us to know right now because these systems are so difficult to experiment on. But lots of amazing work has been done actually in Canada by someone called Susan Simard and her students and her team and her colleagues. And so this is really a very exciting aspect of not just fungal biology, but ecology in general, because it shows how, if ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms, it shows how organisms are actually connected to each other with these persistent physical connections, in this case, these fungal networks. And so it does change the way we think about forests. We think about forests rather than as this collection of individual trees, we think of them as a network of trees bound together in some way by their fungal partners in this very ancient symbiosis.
Now, the human brain is understood to be a series of networks of connections, and so is a forest. Does that mean should we be thinking of the forest as intelligent? Is that follow logically from what you're saying?
I think we should think about the organisms within the forest as intelligent. I mean, intelligence has been somewhat of a battleground concept for a while, and classically, it's been defined in human terms, and intelligent behaviors are those behaviors that require, usually in classical terms, a brain. And so if organisms look like us and behave like us, then we've judged them to have intelligent behaviors, but never as intelligent as us. We're obviously on the top of the pile in this rigid hierarchy, and we use ourselves as yardsticks to judge all other organisms. And this is perhaps a very biased view, and it puts humans at the center of the world and makes us exceptional, and it maybe blinds us to the amazing things that other organisms can do. And so in recent years, thankfully, the concept of intelligence has deepened and expanded, and now there are a variety of definitions on order, and most of them refer to organisms' ability to solve problems and make decisions between alternative courses of action, to adapt to their environment. According to these definitions, almost all organisms qualify as intelligent to some degree. It makes more sense in this revision to think about organisms as, rather than being intelligent or not, to think about how intelligent they are and what sorts of intelligence they possess. And so plants and fungi are both sensitive organisms. You know, they're monitoring their environment. They're sensitive to light. They're sensitive to gravity, to temperature, to acidity, to all sorts of chemicals. They have sophisticated trading relationships with each other. They're able to defend themselves. They're able to finely regulate their behavior and to integrate sense data from all these different sensory parts themselves, and do that without a brain somehow. And so we can think about their behaviors as absolutely as intelligent behaviors, but intelligent in the context of their lives, intelligent to solve the sorts of problems that they need to solve. And so we can think about forests as what happens when all these organisms sensing and regulating their behavior in complex and sophisticated ways comes together to form this big collaborative space where many, many such organisms can live, and which can become incredibly diverse places.
Well, you know, again, that notion of diversity, intelligence as we conceive of it is saying, okay, there's choice A, there's choice B, and how do we deal with it? You talk quite beautifully about how for a fungal net, for fungi, they'll take door A and B at the same time, right? And so just maybe can you walk us through how different that approach to the world is from our linear kind of movement through problem solving?
Yes, so fungi live most of their lives as these fluid networks, these branching, fusing networks of tubular cells, known as mycelium. And mycelium can solve all sorts of problems. And these are maze-dwelling organisms. They're used to exploring these complicated rootscapes and rotscapes in the soil, these labyrinthine passageways filled with charged particles and nutrients and predators, and it's a wild. These are wild places that they have to explore, and they have to somehow keep track of their body, which is subject to continual revision. They have to be able to grow into all these different places, and also withdraw parts of themselves from places they previously explored. And they have to do all this without a brain. And so they have a very different set of challenges and abilities. If you place a block of wood with a fungus living in it on a dish, and you can watch as the fungus sets out from the block of wood to explore its surroundings, and it grows out from the block in a kind of fuzzy white circle. So it's exploring all directions at once. You know, if we were dropped in the middle of a desert and we were asked to go out and look for water, we'd have to pick one direction. And so fungi are different. They can grow in all directions at once. And if one of those bits of the fuzzy white circle encounters a new block of wood, then the fungus withdraws those bits of itself which are exploring without having found any new food, and it will thicken the connections with the new block of wood with its new food source. And so it will completely remodel itself over a few days, and it will look nothing like the network that it did before. And this is the story of fungal life. It's a story of shifting, shape-shifting, of putting their bodies within their food, and their food changes, their source of food changes, so must their body. And it's a way that, and they have many centers of operation. You know, it would make no sense for them to have a center of operation. Brains make sense for us because we're on the move. Moving is how we get away from problems and how we find new solutions. And to move, we want to have our centers of integration neatly packaged in a suitcase of our skull, ready to go at any moment. For fungi, it would make no sense, because if they that bit got eaten or separated from the rest of the network for whatever reason, then they'd be in serious trouble. And so it makes much more sense for them to regulate their behavior everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. And so this is how we see these amazing behaviors. Like when you put fungi through little microscopic labyrinths, they come to a branched, a forked path, and they take both routes at once. This behavior that seems to stretch the limits of possibility and really does stretch your mind when you watch them doing it.
And this process of negotiation between various fungal networks and various trees, it never stops, right? It's a dynamic system. And my limited understanding of the way the brain works is we have a fixed form to the brain, but I was just listening to Dale Eagleman, the neuroscientist, who was saying that the human or an animal brains will adapt to any body. So if you are born missing certain limbs or whatever, your brain just adapts to that. Is that the same? Am I stretching too much here, or is that not the same process that we see at work through a forest? I mean, is it not essentially the same thing in some ways?
There are certainly lots of parallels. Our brains are dynamic networks of cells that have to respond to a changing environment. And so when we learn new things, when we forget old things, our brains are remodeling themselves, that pathways are being thickened and pathways are being pruned. And that's how these fungal networks behave as well. There are parts of them become thickened, parts of them become pruned. There are new connections being made, old connections being lost. So yeah, when we're talking about these living dynamic networks, which have evolved to coordinate sophisticated behavior, and we can think about them as parallel, for sure, in those terms.
I'm just wondering, what do you subscribe to the notion that there is an attempt at communication, that we can actually commune when we consume, say, a psilocybin mushroom?
Yeah, it's a big one. And it's very hard to know, right? It's very hard to know whether we'd be able to understand if a fungus was trying to, let's say that a fungus was trying to communicate with us. How would it do so? And would we notice? Could we ever be sure? It's a bit like other humans. We communicate or other animals, we can tell and we can guess to see if they're communicating, but it's impossible to be completely sure unless we've got some agreed form of language that we concur about. And so with the fungal world, it's easier to start this question to start thinking about it from uncontroversial places like truffles, for example. So truffles are underground fruiting bodies of some species of fungus, and they have to have animals eat them in order to spread their spores. They live underground. Wind can't spread their spores. Animals have to dig them up, eat them, and then carry their spores elsewhere and deposit them in their feces. And to attract animals to do this, they've evolved delicious aromas that humans now covet and charge vast quantities of money for. And so some of them aren't so attractive. Some of them are very attractive to dogs, but smell disgusting to humans. But nonetheless, these truffles have evolved a powerful ability to summon animals using these beacons, these olfactory beacons. And it works, and that's their entire survival depends on their ability to communicate their readiness to be eaten. Same goes for plants. Plants do this all the time. Why are fruits red or yellow, or when they ripen, there's a kind of signal to these animals who are going to disperse their seeds. Flowers, they set off very clear signals to pollinators, using scent, using color, and so there are these communications which are very clear to us and very clear to organisms that aren't human as well. There's obviously something being understood here. When there's usually the outcome of many, many years of evolutionary entanglement between these different organisms. Their lives are somehow important for each other. So when it comes to psilocybin, it's tricky to know, because psilocybin was first produced, people think, about 75 million years ago. So this is a very long time before humans came about. So obviously, psilocybin arose in a human-free world, and these fungi were able to, that could produce these mushrooms, were perfectly able to reproduce for these tens of millions of years until humans came along. So there are all sorts of examples of compounds, drug compounds, psychoactive compounds, finding some kind of these plants or fungi that produce them slipping into new relationships with humans. Caffeine, for example, probably evolved as a way to deter plant herbivores, and likewise with nicotine. And then humans find out that these actually alter their bodies in ways that they like. And so these plants that produce them then fall into a new kind of evolutionary lockstep with humans and become domesticated. And so with the psilocybin mushrooms, it's very clear, in the last few decades, a handful of tropical mushroom species have started to be cultivated in all corners of the world, growing in warehouses, on people's windowsills, in their cupboards, in their bedrooms, under their beds. And a chemical which might once have served to baffle the pest of this mushroom has turned into a lure, and humans and these mushrooms are now entering a new kind of evolutionary relationship of domestication. And so in this context, you can think about it in a similar terms to the context that we think about, in the way that we think about these other stories of domestication, with these signals of ripe fruit or ripe flowers, and rewards for behaving in a certain way that help these organisms survive. So I think that's a clearer way in. I mean, it's when one takes psilocybin, there's a lot of people report a very clear feeling that there's communication going on. And these experiences are perfectly real, in the sense that people reliably have these experiences. Whether or not these experiences, this sense of communication is actually referring to these mushrooms speaking to them or not, is, as I said, very hard to know.
Now, but I think you touch on this in the book, that what do you think, if we were to take that leap of faith into the controversial notion that maybe there is a kind of a message coming to us from our fungal ancestors, our cousins, what is it about, what do you think they're saying to us, and what do you think the way that they interact with the ecosystem can teach us as we sort of reach the limits, in some ways, seemingly, of our current mode of interacting with the world, the sort of purely extractive relationship with the natural environment. Is there something they can teach us, or is that just too out there, or too far from science to get into?
No, I think there's a lot they can teach us, and whether they teach that to us through ingesting the psychedelic mushrooms or not, certainly people have ingesting psychedelic mushrooms has been helpful to a lot of people for a number of different reasons, and there's been a lot of recent research on the ability of these compounds to help people overcome treatment-resistant depression, anxiety following terminal diagnoses, and many more things. So, but in other sense, more generally, I think there's a lot we can learn from fungi. So as we look forward to a life on this damaged planet, and as we look to try and adapt our behaviors, perhaps to be less ecocidal, perhaps even be sustainable, and we can think about the ways that these organisms have done so. Fungi have persisted through 5 major extinction events. They'll no doubt persist through the 6th, which is in full swing. And they've done so by being flexible, inventive, and collaborative. And there may be ways that we can be the same. We can maybe strike up new types of relationship with organisms to help us adapt to these various crises that face us. And there are a number of mycologists, radical mycologists, who are working to form exactly this kind of solution with fungi. For example, some people are trying to enlist fungi to help break down pollutants in the environment. It's known as mycoremediation. Some of them are building new materials using fungi, so revising the way that we produce, like, say, fabrication materials for use in construction, or leather-like materials for use in clothes.
Yeah, I mean, just if we can look at that for just as you actually suggest that, I mean, there are people now building chairs instead of using plastic, growing a kind of growing a chair, and you suggest even you could conceivably grow a house where the electrical would be grown right in. Can you just, I mean, that sounds totally implausible at first blush. Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
So what's going on right now? What's very well established and what's in widespread use is making materials like, for example, packaging materials or packaging corners for shipping servers. They'll ship thousands of servers a year using fungal packaging. IKEA revising their systems to incorporate fungal packaging. And the company Ecology Design, who are building these bricks, they can build structures using these composite materials, these fungal composites. And so, and fungal leathers, again, this is in full swing, and it will transform the way that we do fashion. And it's a big deal. So then on maybe the cutting edge of fungal fabrication, there's a group of architects and unconventional computing experts who are trying to build a structure which uses this fact that fungi form these long cells, long branched cells, and to try and encourage them to grow into circuits that could be used if you persuade the fungus to consume these conductive particles when it's alive and then dry it, then you can have a kind of bio wires formed out of these fungal cells when they've died. And can these circuits be incorporated into the building so that actually the building material and the circuitry inside the building are made of one and the same stuff? And whether this will work or not is still up in the air. This group are working on prototypes as we speak, so we'll have to wait and see. But this is exactly the kind of project that we can expect to see more and more of as people turn their attention towards these astonishing organisms.
And you also talk about the way that we can feed our waste to, I mean, including feces. You talk, I mean, kind of horrifically about that an edible mushroom can grow from diapers, which is not something I want to see on a menu anytime soon. But it's kind of remarkable when we think about the world we're in right now, how our waste is piling up. So not only can they, this almost seems like magic. If you can turn feces, the human feces, into the stuff of life, that's kind of wild. And also plastics, we can actually use, you sort of just touched on that briefly, but tell us more, like, is it possible that plastic, which seems to never biodegrade, seems to, microplastics are everywhere. This seems to be one of the major issues that we're facing as a species, is the amount of plastic that we've left everywhere, and its damaging effects on us now are just starting to come to light. Is it possible that our fungal cousins could be the answer to this problem too?
Yeah, so it's possible, and these solutions need to be developed. But nonetheless, there are fungi that will digest certain plastics. There was a plastic found in a fungus found in a rubbish dump a few years ago that was able to digest these polyurethane plastics. And someone I know, someone called Peter McCoy, who is this amazing researcher and fungal communicator and organizer, and he did this great experiment where he grew Pleurotus mycelium, which produces oyster mushrooms. He grew this on used cigarette butts, and so the fungus was not able to digest the cigarette butts, but cigarette butts drenched with toxic polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And so these are just little examples of the metabolic ingenuity of these organisms, which are, after all, these great recyclers, and have been recycling waste, or what we might think of as waste, for a very long time. Of course, it's food for them, waste for us. But when plants started to make wood, this great innovation to make wood, which is very difficult to break down, fungi eventually worked out how to break that down, and that was a major step forwards for, at least a step towards the planet as we now know it. And so if we can think about our waste streams and reimagine our waste streams in terms of fungal appetites, rather than just putting it all together and putting it in a hole in the ground, which is not a very sophisticated way of dealing with it. If we can return to some idea of a cycle, these things are always cycling round. It's like any traditional farmer would know this, that human waste is a valuable commodity, because human waste will rot down and produce valuable manure, and that will produce your food. Your food will then produce the waste. And this is basic intuition for anyone who is living in close relationship to their environment, and we're just divorced from these steps in the waste chain. So we think about this all as very far from us, or separate from us, or as parts of separate, different issues that aren't connected. Of course, they're very connected, and we need to start joining those dots together. And fungi can help us to do so.
And even metabolizing radiation, right? I mean, talk about things growing in Chernobyl. This seems science fiction, and I'm wondering, do you see this as the way forward in terms of how we do waste management, how we think about everything, or is it too far off to deal? I mean, I guess I'm just curious about your sense of the timing as the planet heats up and as we get closer and closer to the brink of sort of whether the biome can support us or not. Do you think our the work that's being done is progressing fast enough? Does it need more attention? I mean, what's the next step in terms of using some of this technology to keep us all alive?
Mm-hmm. Next step is major investment. Like many things, it's being held by lack of investment, and it's not straightforward. So you can't just put a fungus in a rotting in a polluted environment and expect it to single-handedly remediate the site, because there's all these other organisms living there. There are various changes in temperature or various environmental conditions that might not suit the fungus. So what a fungus can do in a lab is not necessarily what it would be able to do outside. However, there are lots of ways to think carefully about how fungi can be used outside, and normally you have to think about more than the fungus as well. You have to think about what the other plants are doing. What are the humans doing around this fungus and these fungi and these plants? Now, how are we regenerating that entire ecosystem? So that way takes more of an ecosystem view, which isn't so amenable to sort of industrial quick fixes, which is the way that they're normally thought about now. These crises are normally thought about now. One of the most interesting approaches to this problem is being pioneered by a company called Mycocycle, and Peter McCoy is involved with this project as well. And this involves, rather than waiting until we've polluted the environment and then encouraging the fungus to help us clean it up, to reimagine the waste stream such that we don't put it in the environment, we just divert it into the waiting fungal appetite in some particular facility which has got the right conditions. It's got everything is perfectly tuned to conduct some kind of fungal reaction. So, for example, they're working with asphalt roofing. If you can harness the asphalt roofing, get it before it hits the landfill, then let it undergo some kind of decomposition into safer or more usable byproducts, and then put those byproducts on their way into different parts of the waste stream. And then there's a very good chance of making it work in a scalable an effective way. So that's where I think the most progressive work on this is happening right now.
It's so fascinating. One of the really fun things that you did around the promotion of this book was you fed your book to fungus, and then you ate it, and you ate your own words. Can you just tell everyone a little bit about that, what you did there?
Yeah, well, I got the book, and then you can introduce the book to fungal mycelium, and there was the pleurotus fungus, the fungus that produces oyster mushrooms. And pleurotus is a very amazing omnivorous fungus, and it can digest crude oil, it can digest the used cigarette butt one, it can digest glyphosate, anyway, so a book's a minor challenge for this fungus, and so you let the mycelium run through the book, and then when the whole book is a kind of fuzzy white block, and then you let it fruit, and so then it started to grow oyster mushrooms, which I then cut and I ate them, and it was a way of, when we talk about things, especially in scientific contexts, it's easy to become very abstracted from what you're talking about. It's easy to imagine yourself as somehow separate from the world in which your subject matter is living and dying, and so I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write the book and me firmly back into the story, because I'd felt a bit of this separation, inevitable separation, all this time sitting at a computer. And so by folding the book into these metabolic cycles that I'd spent all this time talking about in the book, I was able to join the circuit, and it was a gratifying feeling to be able to eat my words.
And it is available. There's a video of you eating it, which is remarkable. But you also fermented a copy, right? You were going to make it into how did it taste? Have you drunk it yet?
So I'm still working on this. I'm still optimizing the protocols. This is the next thing to take place. So you've got to digest the cellulose into sugars and then ferment the sugars, and then you have your alcoholic drink. I'll have to fill you in at a later date.
Okay, this is one of the things that since I finished the book about a month ago, I've been dying to know how did it taste as booze. Just how is the fermented book, and just the last again that process of your words being transformed into food. You also put electrodes on the book and you recorded a rhythm, and I can tell you I've played this rhythm. I played it for musicians, and I've yet to play it for a musician who is not immediately intrigued by the sound that this makes. Can you just tell us what you did and then what you've done with that file, with that sound?
So this was an idea. I was working in collaboration with a sound ecologist called Michael Prime, and he has a device which he uses to, you put these electrodes on. So the fungus was digesting the book. We wanted to record the activity of the fungus as it does digesting the book. So he puts these electrodes on the fungus on either end of the book, this book covered with mycelium. And the electrodes pick up the bioelectric activity of the fungus. So this fungus, as it's digesting the book, its bioelectrical activity is fluctuating constantly, and depending on what it's doing at that moment, what time of day it is it fruiting, is it not fruiting, how moist is it, how dry is it. And so what you hear when you're hearing the sound is this electric signals from the fungus then get passed through this into this box, and so they then control a sound, an oscillator. So in a synthesizer, you have an oscillator which produces a sound. So there's a sound being produced by electronically, and the fungus is modulating that signal. So it's not that the fungus is making this sound as a sound. It's more that this sound is a way of making audible the metabolic activity of the fungus as it eats the book. So what you're hearing is, this is as close as we can get to, at least, it's a way of making it accessible to our senses. So you can tune into what the fungus is up to through sound. And so then I used the sound, and with my brother, we made a song using those sounds called Entangled Life. The idea was to make a song about the book made from the electrical activity of the fungus digesting the book. So again, it's one of these, we just tried to keep closing this loop in as many ways as we could. It's quite fun.
That's fantastic. Now, I'm just curious, as we end our session today, you've given such a gift to readers, I think, with this book, in terms of just forcing me to look at my environment differently, forcing me to think about the way I think of the natural world and my place in it. What is it you are taking from this book? Where are you going next? Where is the area that you feel that you're going to be really focused on for the next little while? Is there a project you're working on now?
Well, at the moment, I'm in the cyclone of book promotion, so I haven't quite got through that and moved on to the next thing. But one thing that I'm interested to do is to do more research into the behavior of these mycelial networks. How do they coordinate themselves? And I hope to do some work on the way that they use electrical signals to coordinate their behavior. Fascinating new area of study which has been really under-researched and which could help us to understand these organisms in new ways.
Fantastic. Well, Merlin, thank you so much for Entangled Life and for being with us this afternoon. And I hope the book promotion continues and goes well, but I really also hope you're able to leave it aside and get back to discovering more about the world and then sharing it with us. So thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thanks for having me.